Here's a very small sample. Most of it is simply too grisly to show. There was the summary beheading of 200 migrants. The casino fire which killed at least 50. The preferred method of killing involves beheading with chainsaws. Other victims are dissolved in vats of acid. Much of this was filmed by the Zetas, a kind of show and tell of horrors.
This is the brutal reality of the Los Zetas cartel. Los Zetas upped the violence of Mexican cartels to an unprecedented level. Then its leader, Miguel Treviño Morales, aka Z40, upped Los Zetas' violence. Yep, in the world of monstrous brutality, there's always a bigger fish. Let's explore the rise and fall of Los Zetas and their terrible leader, Z40. But before we go on, I must warn you, the following video contains very graphic details of torture and murder. Today's video begins with the Gulf Cartel. Wasn't this about Los Zetas? Sure, but Los Zetas started out as the Gulf Cartel's militarized army. Back in the 1990s, the Gulf Cartel was one of the mightiest and most feared cartels in Mexico, along with El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel. But as always, they were fighting to have a monopoly over smuggling routes and production. So the Gulf Cartel's leader, Osiel Cardenas Guillen, got an idea. He hired an army lieutenant, Arturo Guzman de Sina, known by his military radio code, Z1. Thus, Los Zetas, which literally translates as the Z's, took shape. Los Zetas were named after the soldiers' military codes. This goes to show the big change that Los Zetas brought to modern-day cartels.
The first Zeta he recruited was Arturo Guzman de Sena. So what you saw was a change in the way drug cartels fought with violence. It was no longer those gang members with shaved heads and tattoos, fighting with pistols and knives. It was militarized style, fighting like military units. And once they did it, this was spread across to every cartel in Mexico.
Arturo de Sena thus deserted the army and brought along at least 30 more deserters. And ironically, having military training meant Los Zetas were even more violent than their untrained counterparts.
So the Zetas really upped the ante of violence within their conflict and their use of terror. I think a lot of this comes from the fact they were from the military and they had this instruction of how you defeat insurgencies, this anti-insurgency training that had originated in the United States, and this idea that you control territories through the use of terror.
Los Zetas became so brutal that this became a goal in itself. Before long, the army generals would offer honor medals to the most brutal soldiers. And there was one final factor that upped the violence even further: the infamous war on drugs. In the early 2000s, the Mexican government announced a more ruthless approach to ending cartel violence. Sadly, this only made cartels more violent as they struggled to assert dominance. In 2002, Arturo de Sena was killed by the Mexican military, who was trying out the kingpin strategy: eliminate cartel leaders and make their cartel crumble under their loss. This had worked a decade before in Colombia with Pablo Escobar, but now it would lead to pure chaos. 5 years later, Osiel Cardenas was also arrested and extradited to the US. So Los Zetas broke off from the Gulf Cartel and formed a stronger, more organized cartel.
You had this small unit which grew and grew, and that is the Zetas inside the Gulf Cartel, until eventually it was like a whole army within the Gulf Cartel that would rise up saying, we don't need you anymore, we're going to take this for ourselves, and then break away from the Gulf Cartel and form its own organization. And this erupting into open warfare in 2010 between the Zetas and the Gulf Cartel.
From 2010 to 2015, Los Zetas made a name as Mexico's most brutal cartel, leaving piles of mutilated bodies behind them everywhere they went. And at the center of the terror was a man named Miguel Treviño Morales. In 2010, Los Zetas became their own cartel, with Heriberto Lozcano at the top. Heriberto was one of the 30 deserters recruited by Arturo de Sena, so he knew the ins and outs of Los Zetas, perhaps better than anyone. His soldiers wanted him as their leader. The problem, as you might imagine, was the Gulf Cartel hated this. This was the beginning of a terrible war that would cost thousands of lives, including innocent people trapped in the middle. Los Zetas had a military-trained boss and were more organized than the Gulf Cartel or any other cartel at the time, so they posed a real threat to the Gulf Cartel. But Heriberto's right-hand man, Miguel Treviño Morales, had no military training. He was born on November 18, 1970, in Tamaulipas, into a family of 13 children. As one of the oldest brothers, Miguel took care of his family after his father abandoned them. Pressed for cash, he entered the criminal world as a young teen. During the 1990s, he worked for the Gulf Cartel drug lord, Hector Manuela Sauceda Gamboa, aka El Cádiz, who became his mentor. In the late 1990s, Los Zetas hired him for his skills in moving contraband across the border. He lived between Mexico and Texas all his life, and this was his specialty. By 2005, Miguel's job was fighting off insurgents from the Sinaloa cartel in the Nuevo Laredo area. But that's not all he did. Apparently, Miguel was good at grooming young teens into brutal assassins. He called them Zetitas, little Zetas, and had them kill rival sicarios, officers, and anyone who got in the Zetas' way. Some of the Zetitas were 12 years old. In 2007, under Heriberto's orders, Miguel led a vicious ambush in Guatemala, personally killing drug lord Juan Jose Leon Ardon. That earned him the vice general position, despite his lack of military training. By 2010, when Los Zetas became their own cartel, Miguel already had ambitions to be their leader. According to some sources, he was fighting for the kingpin position as early as Heriberto took over. According to other sources, he was actually ruling Los Zetas, commanding their horrific attacks while Heriberto took care of more administrative matters. Whichever the case, both men had a great number of followers, and when Heriberto was gunned down by the Mexican military in October 2012, Miguel took over Los Zetas. Here are some of the things he did between 2010 and 2015. In August 2010, Miguel had Los Zetas kill 72 undocumented immigrants on the mere suspicion that they might end up recruited by the Gulf Cartel. The next year, he stopped a group of buses headed from Texas to Mexico. Over 200 people were kidnapped and taken to a ranch in San Fernando. There, Miguel and his Zeta sicarios violated dozens of women, forced the men to watch, then forced the men to fight each other to the death. Whoever survived would be recruited into Los Zetas, and whoever died, well, they were tortured for hours first. Miguel laughed as he watched this. For him, it was entertaining. Why did Los Zetas do this? Once again, they suspected these people were going to be recruited by the Gulf Cartel. In August 2011, Miguel's men set fire to a whole casino in Monterrey after the casino failed to pay protection money.
There was the summary beheading of 200 migrants. The casino fire which killed at least 50. The preferred method of killing involves beheading with chainsaws. Much of this was filmed by the Zetas, a kind of show and tell of horrors.
Well, Los Zetas might have preferred chainsaws, but Miguel's methods were even more monstrous.
They also prepare guisos. These are stews where you take a member of the family and you put them in a pig boiler and you pour gasoline on them and then you set a match to them.
Yeah, Miguel Morales' trademark method was slowly boiling his victims alive. It was either boiling or slow burning.
They put these individuals in a 55-gallon drum using diesel because diesel burns slower.
The more he could prolong his victims' suffering, the better. In 2020, the Irish Times reported the discovery of 12 kitchens Los Zetas used to cook. The description itself is scarring enough.
Bloody handprints on walls, stained clothes, plastic cable ties, machetes, and, as one person observes, the crunch of bones beneath a thick blanket of ash.
Miguel was a real-life monster, and sometimes he'd make his own sicarios sick. Reportedly, when he was done with his enemies, he would kidnap their children too and subject them to the same treatment. And believe it or not, he even boiled babies. Miguel Morales soon made a name for himself throughout Mexico. He was known as a man who truly had no limits and would get a kick out of making others suffer. He remembered people while they were still alive, slow-burned children, and dumped bodies in broad daylight for other children to see. He'd also escaped several gunfights unscathed, almost as if he had a villain superpower. He would also drive around Mexico with sicarios in his car, casually pointing at pedestrians and telling his sicarios, "Kill this one." In 2013, one of his former hitmen told the press that Miguel couldn't sleep at night if he didn't take a life that day. Another journalist wrote that Miguel sometimes ate his victims' still beating hearts. This was one of his many tactics of instilling fear in his enemies and painting himself as the worst drug lord alive. And arguably, the worst rumor states that Miguel once put one of his enemies' babies in a microwave. Honestly, it's hard enough to talk about these things, let alone imagine they actually happened, all because of one sick man and his many followers. And many of the terrorized people in Mexico see bodies every day. Once, 23 people were hung from a bridge above a busy road. Another time, Los Zetas left 49 decapitated bodies on the side of a similar road. Children can stumble upon these sites as they're walking to school in the morning. And here's an even more tragic twist. This might work in the Los Zetas' favor. If a child sees enough violence, they become desensitized by the time they're teenagers. So they make easy recruits for the cartel. More Zetitas for Miguel. Another horrible method Miguel is partially responsible for is filming Los Zetas' videos.
When you have plastic bags on the backdrop, you know something's going to happen. You know that they don't want to stain something.
This was a simple way for Los Zetas to spread their message that they are not to be messed with. Today, the infamous Jalisco New Generation cartel employs the same method. But some of the most gruesome videos out there are Los Zetas'. One of them is particularly terrifying. In the video, 3 men are blindfolded and their hands are tied behind their backs. None of them are older than 25. In the first few minutes, the victims gave their names and confirmed that they worked for the Los Zetas' arch-enemies, the Gulf Cartel. They were also forced to downgrade their cartel and praise Los Zetas. As soon as the third man had finished talking, the executioners started lashing away at the first man's throat. He slowly cut his throat as he let out blood-curdling screams. The second man screamed for even longer until only gurgles could be heard. Both men were then decapitated. And then Zetas proudly showed their heads to the camera, and the third man was reportedly left alive so that he could talk about what he experienced and instill fear in the Gulf Cartel. And that's just one of Los Zetas' many horrible videos. Luckily though, there was a catch to Miguel's monstrosity. He was a monster, not an organized general. His cartel had turned into a bunch of rabid dogs.
They've put them in acid and watched their bodies deteriorate. They have fed them to wild animals.
These were sociopathic, short-tempered killers who also fought each other. After all, this was the only language they knew. Los Zetas' paramilitary training and highly organized skills were waning. This meant they were easier to capture. On July 15, 2013, Miguel Treviño Morales was finally arrested. Somehow, Miguel managed to dodge extradition to the US. To this day, he's serving a life imprisonment sentence in Michoacan federal prison. But this wasn't the end of Los Zetas or their shocking brutality. In 2014, Los Zetas found out that 2 men from the city of Allende had reportedly stolen money from the cartel, so a huge army stormed Allende. But they weren't out for these 2 men. Los Zetas had decided to punish the whole town for it. Somewhere between 300 and 500 people died. Imagine having a kill count so big, you can't even estimate a real number. 80 homes were destroyed with heavy military machinery. Allende was reduced to ashes, and whoever managed to flee became a shadow of the person they once were.
Y les digo a mis hijos, levántense, le digo, porque quién sabe qué está pasando en la calle. Digo, vístanse y nos salimos. Y todo empezó a tronar, ya no había luz, todo empezó a tronar, tanques, camionetas. Pero sí, ahí perdí a mis niños y a mi hija.
And who was leading the Los Zetas at the time? Miguel's brother, Omar. In 2015, Omar was also arrested, and this was the beginning of the end of Los Zetas. At that point, it was more a gang of warring factions than a united cartel. One of the more successful factions is Cartel del Noreste, but even their leader, Juan Gerardo Treviño Chavez, aka El Huevo, was arrested in March 2022. Today, Miguel Treviño Morales' horrible legacy lives through the Jalisco New Generation cartel. El Mencho was inspired by Los Zetas' paramilitary training and equipment and took it to a whole new level with the CJ&G.
Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJ&G, is the single criminal organization most responsible for these deaths on both sides of the border.
The Jalisco New Generation cartel took the fight to the next level, shooting down a military helicopter with a rocket-propelled grenade.
Tonight, the DEA is offering $10 million for information leading to the arrest of the Mexican drug kingpin known as El Mencho.
In a world where the more violent you are, the more money you make, it's hard to imagine cartel violence ever stopping. But as cartels get better technology and more brutal leaders, authorities also find new and more ruthless methods to arrest their kingpins. Perhaps there is an end to people like Miguel Treviño Morales after all. Thanks for watching, guys. What do you think about Los Zetas? Will cartels get increasingly violent, or is it slowly coming to an end? Let me know your thoughts in a comment. And before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell button. See you next time.